If you're thinking of incorporating social thinking into your child's IEP, Individualized Education Program, assessment is a really important beginning step to the process. And Michelle Garcia Winner here explains that it can be a bit complicated, but she breaks it down beautifully. What are some of the assessments and tools that school clinicians can use to look under the rock that nobody usually looks under?
Yeah, so the TOPL is a test of pragmatic language, and if I could rename that test, because it actually shows up strong in the research, I just don't know that researchers are always asking the right questions. I would call it the test of superficial social skills, because it doesn't look deep, but it does make quick judgments about a kid's functioning. And so I can work with kids who I know in reality really struggle, but they score fine on the TOPL. And the problem is in schools is most states you have to score really, really low to get qualified. So in California, it's below the 7th percentile is what's going to indicate a problem. So if I have a kid scoring the 25th percentile, he's not going to qualify. But if I stare at that kid and really watch him, he or she is not relating in a healthy way, may have no friends, may only have provoked relationships, if that, depending on the kid. At lunch or break time, he's always by himself. So one of the things I work with schools on, okay, naturalistic assessment. If this child doesn't really know how to create or maintain friendships, is he in the bottom 7th percentile of players on campus? Is he in the bottom 7th percentile of the how to participate in a classroom? Are we always calling this kid out on a behavior problem, disrupting the class? Is it the bottom 7%? Is he in the bottom 7 of 100 kids? And if the word come back, yes, now we got to figure out, okay, what's driving that? And there's other tools and assessments I'll mention now. I'll just keep going. So I work with schools, sometimes humorously, and when I say schools, I mean parents too, because I think parents need to be very actively on board in all the treatments. When I started working in the schools, I'd already been in the field of autism since the 70s. And I started in the schools in the mid-90s, and I knew that I was not going to get far with my students if I didn't involve the parents. So first thing I did is I started a parent group. And in that parent group, I let parents know their responsibilities and to learn about their responsibilities for teaching towards the IEP as well. I think parents should have a role on the IEP and not just teachers, because this is social 24/7. But when we're doing that, now we got to be able to figure out a few things. So one is, how does this kid play, or how does he relate in the classroom compared to others? And then another one, this sounds silly, but if everybody in the school knows the kid's name and he's not a jock and he's not a rock star, he probably has a social disability or some kind of significant disability. Some are obvious, but I work with kids who people know their names so quickly because they just stand out as awkward and odd. And the best assessors on campus are the peers. It's not adults, because adults forgive children for mistakes. So adults will say, the kid got together with me and he talked about cars the entire time. He was so interested in talking to me about cars. He had a great conversation with me. He doesn't have a problem. The peers think, all this kid does talk about cars. He's not interested in me. He never asked me about me. He's got a problem. We're not interested. So we look at some of the naturalistic. I also have, there's a scale out there called the Social Responsiveness Scale, the SRS. That gets really good. It's something parents can fill out, teachers can fill out to give you some assessment of more functional. And this is not just autism, this cuts across. So Social Responsiveness Scale, different scales of, the gold standard in the field of autism for diagnosis is the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, and the Autism Diagnostic Interview, which help to get a bigger picture on a kid. But when you're working from day to day, I actually found and I've written quite a bit on the problem with standardized tests, and the way I describe our kids is they can look really good on paper and not so good in person. And so I talk about, okay, how's this kid looking on paper versus person? And the frustration was too many of my kids looked good on paper, frustrating to me because I want to give them services. I see they're going to have major problems, so I started creating my own tasks. So I have a book called Thinking About You, Thinking About Me. Last edition was 2007, and I've written a bunch of little assessment tasks people can do for almost no money. So one of them is getting folks to follow my eyes and tell me what I'm looking at in the assessment room. And then after we see if they can even track my eyes to see what I'm looking at, and then the next thing I do is have them, if I'm looking at the telephone and they told me I looked at the telephone, I'll say, now tell me what I'm thinking about. And eventually, I go back and I look at the telephone, and sometimes I get kids who might fall under the diagnosis of ADHD or Asperger's, and they'll go, I wouldn't presume to guess what you were thinking about. And I go, oh, you should, because social's all about making guesses.
Right.
And we do some other tasks. I have something called a double interview, because I learned that if I talk to a kid, the kid will tell me all about them, but what they don't do is show any interest in their peers. So I set up this thing like, I interview them, I let them know I've interviewed them, I tell them I asked questions, I found out all this information, and then I say to them, you've never met me before, you don't really know very much about me. Let me look at a few pictures of my life. I show them some pictures of myself with my daughters, my friends, and then I say, there's some information about me. I want you to be the interviewer. Now you get to ask me about me. So I'm formally giving them permission to ask me, and then I see what they can come up with. And very often, kids with social learning challenges can't switch perspective. So if I ask them about them, that's their best. They only have to think about themselves. But now they have to jump into, wow, how do I organize around another person? How do I focus my attention? I've had folks in adults, people in graduate school, students. I've got some tough high school kids who go, no offense, lady, I'm just not interested in you. And I go, no offense taken, do it anyway. And then you'll see that often they can't do it. And I'll work with them on, hey, have you noticed that it's hard for you to talk to kids and ask them questions? And even kind of my most challenging kid, often I found their weakness. And they may say, yeah, it is hard. And I go, do you know we can work on strategies? Because then right away I want to let them know there's ways I can teach you to understand how to jump into someone else's mind, to organize around them, and ask some questions, and what our social expectations are around that. We have some other tests. I won't describe them all.
Okay, so for the clinicians in schools, is there anything that we can put up on our website? Here's a sort of a menu of some of the assessments. Or is it all just in your head and nobody can get to it?
Well, no, those are provided through my book, Thinking About You, Think About Me.
Okay.
I do give a lot of free resources, but not all of them are for free.
Sure.
And so that you get through that book.
So, okay, excellent. Who are the most appropriate clinicians in a school setting for this? Because under the IDEA, the students have to be evaluated minimally every 3 years, if it's a triennial, or perhaps if it's in the referral to special education process for the first time. And the suspected area of disability is social pragmatics. Who are the clinicians who are best served to evaluate?
Well, it could be the speech language pathologist. It could be the school psychologist. It could be with the help of the school counselor if they have one on board. I've seen special education teachers become really interested in social, but typically when we're looking at the level of giving this the assessment itself, it typically, but I won't say always, falls under speech language pathologist or school psychologist, and most typically under speech pathologist. However, there's, as I was mentioning, no one's trained in this, and even though I'm a speech pathologist, we're not highly trained in this, so people often just turn to the standardized tests. And I'll just mention for your audience quickly, the biggest problem I find in standardized tests is we're asking you a hypothetical question about something that's not happening in the here and now. We often give you a visual card to help interpret and then project how kids should be behaving. And while some kids still can't get the answer to it, many of my higher functioning kids know the answer of what they should do. But in the moment of true interaction, they can't self-regulate at the level of the here and now, where you have milliseconds to 2 seconds. So we're qualifying, we're assessing to see if a kid has social competency issues. But when we give them social standardized test scores, we're not actually testing competency, we're testing social knowledge. That it's, another example of that is kids who can score really well on a written expression test because they've checked off they know the answers to the multiple choice questions for punctuation and grammar, But when you ask them to actually use punctuation and grammar in real-time writing, they fall apart. So when you get to the social mind, it's really important that we assess competency in the moment and not just how would you answer a hypothetical question that is not in the moment, and we give you as much time as you want to figure out this answer, because in real-time communication we have milliseconds to 2 seconds to process and respond.
As Michelle has explained, assessing a student's social skills and looking at this whole area of social thinking is very complicated. It involves an analysis both of actual standardized tests as well as in the moment assessment of how the student does truly in the educational environment when they're asked to have social skills in action. So it's really complicated, but Julie and I want to make sure that we remind parents and districts that students are required to be evaluated by federal law in all suspected areas of disability. So if you suspect that your child has a deficit in social skills, you want to make sure that that child is not being evaluated purely in academic areas, because you really need to look in depth at those social skills.